Right, hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We're just going to wait a few minutes to let folks trickle in. It looks like we're getting a very exciting turnout. We'll just wait a couple more minutes because we've got folks still coming into the Zoom room with us. All right, welcome in, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ryan Finnigan. I'm the Deputy Director of Research here at the Terner Center for Housing Innovation, and we're thrilled to be hosting a conversation about recent changes to California's impact fee landscape and how cities are working to make it easier for housing developers to navigate. Before I get started, I'd like to thank Crankstart and the Conrad and Hilton Foundation for their support of this work. Also, we are recording today's conversation and we will make it available on our website within the coming days. And if you registered, then you should get an email notification when that's available for you. To start off our webinar today, I'm going to present a little bit of research findings from Terner Center's recent and ongoing work on development impact fees before we move on to a panel discussion among a group of very engaged and exciting local practitioners moderated by our Deputy Policy Director, David Garcia. So first, just to set the stage a little bit, let's do some level setting on what exactly we're talking about today. Today's webinar focuses on development impact fees, which are fees charged on new housing development that are meant to mitigate or offset the impact of new homes and residents on local infrastructure, like parks, roads, and public safety facilities. Impact fees that are levied on new development can only pay for the expansions or improvements to public infrastructure that's needed to accommodate the new development. Impact fees on new developments cannot pay for things like maintenance and operations or other pre-existing infrastructure needs. So I'll note that this does not include development service fees like planning and building fees, which are not used to contribute to new public infrastructure. These are fees that pay for planning departments' work during the application and entitlement process, including things like plan checks, design reviews, issuing permits, and inspections. And so laws and legal rulings regarding impact fees, including but not limited to some Supreme Court rulings and California's Mitigation Fee Act, require two things of a development impact fee. First is that it must have, quote, an essential nexus between new housing development and an impact fee. So, for example, there must be a demonstrated increase in demand for things like wider roads or higher quality level of service as new residents move into these new homes. And second, the fee must be proportional to the development's impact, meaning that the fee levied on the new housing must kind of in some way be in line with the actual cost of expanding the necessary infrastructure. And so the new work being done by both the state and local governments around impact fee policies are meant to try to balance two things. First, impact fees add to the cost of new housing, and from the point of view of housing developers, can be challenging to predict and budget for. And second, within the constraints of Prop 13, many cities must rely on impact fees to expand and improve public infrastructure in order to accommodate new housing. So the state and local governments have been working to make impact fees more consistent from one fee to the next, transparent and predictable so that developers can understand what the total fee amounts might be as they embark on a new development, and equitable, meaning that they are proportional and well used. And so these efforts include the passage of several state laws in recent years. And the research findings that I'll present are from our work trying to understand how these laws are being implemented. And in order to gain that understanding, we've done things like reviewing local impact fee policies from a sample of about 41 jurisdictions. We've been analyzing housing production and financing data, and we've been conducting interviews with both housing developers and city planners across the state. So first, recent state laws are pushing for more transparency in fee rates and amounts, calculation bases, and payment timelines. And so in our review of jurisdictions that we conducted in 2024, we found that almost all jurisdictions are publishing impact fee schedules, rates, and estimated total fee amounts. However, this information is sometimes embedded in places like municipal codes or local housing elements rather than in a plain to read fee schedule that's posted on a department website. However, planning departments had told us that they are prioritizing that kind of transparency, particularly in light of new state regulations around how that information must be presented. Even with published fee schedules and estimates for prototypical projects, however, several interviewees said that calculating fees is often still complicated, and that's true for both developers and planners. That's partly because fees are levied by many types of entities. So local city governments levy fees, but there are also fees levied by schools, regional transportation authorities, park districts, etc. It's also challenging because many of the fees use a different type of calculation basis. So that could be things like fees levied per unit versus levied per square foot. And so developers told us that fee calculators and pre-application consultations with local government staff are often the most helpful ways to understand what the total amount of fees might be for a given type of jurisdiction. And among the 41 jurisdictions that we reviewed, 10 of them provided something like a fee calculator or a process for working with a planner to get that kind of project-specific fee estimate. The calculators were particularly helpful in the early stages of the development process, but local city planners also told us that they could be difficult to create. And the fee calculators require information to be input both from the city across its range of fee types, as well as from other entities that levy fees. And they have to be able to accommodate a number of different factors of a development and ways of calculating these types of fees. In terms of the coordination issue, that was one thing that was raised by both developers and jurisdictions. So many of the new state laws regarding impact fees target the types of policies and fees set by local jurisdictions specifically, but that can still create room for many types of surprises that developers said could come up when there are fees levied by other things like utility departments, for example. As one developer told us, the fees from the city of Los Angeles are actually quite easy to estimate and very clear. And then it was things like the utility connections that were much more unpredictable from their point of view. And that's in part because the utility connections sometimes require information that is hard for a developer or for a city planner to know at the outset of a development and depends on the specifics of the new infrastructure that must be put in place or the types of connections being made to the new development. Jurisdictions are also working to advance how equitably impact fees are levied and used. So AB 602 requires jurisdictions to base their impact fee rates on unit square footage rather than the number of units in a development or to justify an alternative basis. And this calculation basis is meant to ensure proportionality between fee rates and new homes' impacts on local infrastructure. So smaller homes with fewer people will have less of an impact on public infrastructure. And this basis is also meant to encourage affordability by design, meaning that lower fees can encourage smaller, more affordable homes. As of 2024, 11 of the 40 jurisdictions that we reviewed use square footage bases exclusively in order to calculate their impact fees. But in addition to using a square footage basis, jurisdictions were pursuing several strategies that were meant to achieve proportionality between development's impacts and the fee amounts, such as the number of bedrooms rather than the square footage of the unit. Basing fees on square footage can also be administratively challenging to administer, in part because there are often small changes to home sizes that can occur throughout the development process, meaning that there are often alternative bases that accomplish the goal of proportionality while being easier to administer. Jurisdictions are also improving the equity in the uses of their impact fee revenues. So, for example, the City of San Diego's Build Better SD initiative created citywide consolidated funds for the fire, library, and mobility impact fee programs. Previously, impact fees for each of these types of uses went into several different local funds, and these individual local funds were often insufficient on their own to pay for infrastructure or service improvements. And so as a result, collected fee revenues could go unused for some time until they accumulated enough to pay for an infrastructure improvement. And city staff told us that the Build Better SD initiative allowed them to, quote, more efficiently extend the funding so that everybody across the city can get infrastructure investments rather than nobody. And finally, many local governments are working to encourage affordable housing development by reducing or waiving impact fees for these projects. One recently published Terner Center study found that most new construction projects with low-income housing tax credits pay some amount of impact fees. And this chart is showing you the number of new construction projects with low-income housing tax credits from 2020 to 2023 that paid per unit impact fees in each of these given ranges. While many projects paid little or no fees, there were also many projects that paid $20,000 to $30,000 of fees per unit or over $30,000 per unit. On average, fees were about $19,000 per unit in these affordable developments. In our review of 41 jurisdictions, we found that about 3/4 of them offered some form of an impact fee reduction or waiver for affordable housing. But the chief constraint for these types of initiatives was that the reductions and waivers required alternative funding to pay for infrastructure improvements rather than impact fees. One notable example in recent years has been the City of Sacramento's $0 rate program for affordable units. And so this program allowed each affordable unit in a new development to have a $0 rate for the city's water, sewer, and central city impact fees. And so that $0 rate applied to rental units for low or moderate income households with a 30-year deed restriction. And it also applied to for sale units for low income households. The way that the city set this up was by replacing lost impact fee revenue by setting aside a portion of the city's general fund. One city staff member explained to us, quote, it's been a policy decision from our city council to essentially establish an allowance for this program. But they also noted that the city depleted this funding within some of their given fiscal years. And as a result, developers applying for waivers had to make decisions about whether to wait, and that could also increase total development costs and timelines, or whether to pay for the impact fees in that given year. Notably, the program was also extended to affordable homes that did not receive public subsidies like affordable housing tax credits. And as they explained to us, quote, they wanted to encourage developers who aren't getting any public financing or subsidies to build affordable housing units. These types of waiver and reduction programs can meaningfully reduce costs and help facilitate the production of greater affordable housing. However, there must be sufficient resources available in order to offset the costs of public infrastructure. And with that, I'm going to stop here to save plenty of time for our panel of experts to discuss. You can sign up for our website's email list if you want to make sure that you're staying posted on all of our work regarding impact fees, including our recent reports that have come out on the topic. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Deputy Director of Policy, David Garcia, who's going to facilitate the discussion and introduce our panelists.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan, for the introduction and for the great presentation on the work we've done recently on impact fees. So again, my name is David Garcia. I am the Deputy Director of Policy here at the Terner Center, and I'm really excited to be moderating this conversation with a panel of practitioners folks who are working at the city level to figure out the right ways to calculate fees and to adhere to state law and also to make sure they work with the market in their given community. So before we get started, I'm going to do a quick round of introductions. So first, I'm going to start with uh, Christopher Jordan. Christopher is the Community Development Director for the City of Elk Grove, and he has over 22 years of experience in the planning field. Some of his roles and responsibilities have included urban design and land use planning, public agency staffing, and zoning and development code development administration. So thank you for being with us, Christopher. Next, we have Heidi Vonblum, who is the planning director for the city of San Diego and has over 20 years of experience in both public and private land use and environmental planning and law. Prior to joining the city planning department in 2018, she served as the deputy city attorney in the land use advisory and litigation units in the San Diego City Attorney's Office. So thank you for being with us, Heidi. And we also have Jerad Ferguson, who is principal planner with the city of San Jose. And so in his role, he leads the implementation of the city's housing element and advances city policy across housing policy across city governments. Previously, he spent over a decade advising former mayor and multiple city council members on land use and economic development policy. So thanks again to each of you for making the time to be with us. So I want to start with a general question for everyone. A lot of us in the housing space, and I'm certainly guilty of this as well, we oftentimes frame impact fees as cost inputs for new housing, right? So we know in California, most real estate development projects face on average some of the highest fees in the nation. But there are reasons for this, right? And Ryan alluded to this in his presentation, that cities are really constrained in the ways that they can raise revenue, which makes impact fees one of the only ways in which cities can pay for important infrastructure. So to start, I want to hear from each of our panelists about, how critical impact fees are for your communities to pay for the things that you really need. And so Heidi, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Sure, thanks. So development impact fees are intended to provide infrastructure needed to accommodate new development. If you are a jurisdiction that has adopted prohibitively expensive development impact fees, that can be extremely problematic from a housing production standpoint. But where the city has more appropriate nexus studies, this revenue source is the only revenue source that the city has to be able to provide the infrastructure to support the development. Without infrastructure in our communities, it is very, very hard to get community support for adding more housing within our jurisdictions. But more importantly, it puts cities at significant risk of fiscal instability in the long term. Without the necessary infrastructure, exacerbating an existing problem of cities already having infrastructure deficiencies, it puts the city at a significant risk of long-term financial sustainability. For that, development impact fees are a very, very important part of the capital improvement program budget for our city. But of course, they are not the only funding source. We kind of hear it from both sides. On the one hand, development impact fees, yes, are very important, but they do only make up about 5 to 10% in any given year of our budget for our capital improvement program total. And that is because most of our infrastructure needs are attributable to existing deficiencies. And so they cannot and should not be charged to new development.
Thanks, Heidi. We'll go to Chris next, Christopher.
Yeah, thanks, David. So I think for in Elk Grove's case, we've been incorporated as a city for about almost 26 years now. When we incorporated, our community was about 56,000 people. Today, we're over 182,000 people. So with that growth comes a lot of infrastructure requirements. So it is, to Heidi's point, there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to get built. One of our biggest, or our biggest fee program is our roadway fee program to address those transportation needs. And so while it's critically important to have those revenues so we can deliver big projects like, say, a new interchange on State Route 99 or big arterial construction that spans across the city, we also need it to address fair share issues. We're requiring developers to build certain infrastructure, new signalized intersections, widening of facilities, new construction of roads. And those projects vary in size from 1,000 units in a subdivision all the way down to 3 or 4 units in a subdivision. And so to be able to say, look, you have a fair share cost around this, we have to be able to spread that around and have reimbursable opportunities to developers when they do that oversizing. That's a requirement in state law that we provide that mechanism. So these fee programs are critical in that regard as well to make sure we have that.
Thanks, Christopher and Jerad. Tell us a little bit about how you are using fees in San Jose.
Sure. Thanks, David. Yeah, so San Jose, we kind of have three primary kind of buckets. We have construction taxes, which are impact fees, but still added cost onto new development. Those primarily pay for new infrastructure, new transportation infrastructure, safety improvements as well. And then we have parkland fees. So these go to contribute to new parkland or provide capital improvements to existing parks to serve the new residents. And then through our inclusionary housing ordinance, that can also represent a fee if a developer chooses the in lieu option. And so these are really important, contributors to those various programs I mentioned in terms of, providing the offset of those new residents and contributing to infrastructure. But, we as a city understand that this is kind of the primary cost control that we directly control as a city, the one lever that we have to pull. So we're constantly kind of monitoring what the impact is of our fees on the overall development. We actually take a look yearly or try to be yearly in terms of what the economic feasibility of projects in the city, and understand how our fee stack lines up in the total development stack. And then, our city council can make adjustments to those fee programs if they feel it's necessary. We currently have an incentive program running for multifamily housing that has been pretty successful in terms of getting some projects moving.
Thanks for that, Jerad. So next question for the group, and Heidi, you kind of alluded to this in your first response, was, there aren't that many, or sometimes there are no other sources of revenue to pay for these critical things. But in some jurisdictions, there have been creative ways in which they have been combining the revenue they bring in from fees with other sources to pay for important stuff. So balancing the need for allowing the city to pay for infrastructure without and while limiting the direct amount charged to new homes. So my question for all of you, have you used this approach? What creative ways have you been able to come up with to supplement the revenue you bring in from impact fees to get the stuff built that you need for your communities? Christopher, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, happy to. So I think, we do have a couple of options. Some of our new growth areas will have bond financing programs that go along with them. So a community facilities district, or developers oftentimes will take advantage of SCIP or the BOLD programs as a way to do that. And so we can use those either to help deliver some of that infrastructure that otherwise would be in a fee program obligation, or they can use those bond proceeds to actually pay down the cost of those fees, use it as the payment source for that. So whether it's a city-issued bond program or it's SCIP or BOLD, we can just take those proceeds and apply them on a permit-issued basis in order to do that and help address it. We do have a couple of cases with bond-based programs or areas of town where there are certain facilities that maybe there is some component of the facility that's going to be in facilities or in a impact fee program. But we don't fully fund it necessarily there. We know we have other funding sources may come in, like to get those bond programs, or maybe we know there's some grant programs we could go after for certain infrastructure, like say trails improvements or highway overcrossings for trails and bikes facilities. And so we can assign those fees accordingly and then use those as a way to then manage that. So bonds, I think, have been really helpful in this regard in some of those CFD programs.
Thanks, Christopher. Jerad or Heidi, either of you have any creative ways that you can share with us?
So San Diego is largely built out. And so most of the new housing that we see, which is what we want to see, is happening as infill development, which does bring a special set of challenges when you're planning for infrastructure needs to serve that. We don't easily have the ownership in one parcel owner like we can see in other jurisdictions where there's large new communities being developed. And so we really don't have the ease with which to form other types of bond financing. We do, for specific projects, identify opportunities for grants that fund infrastructure that is helpful to accommodating additional growth. Largely because of the infrastructure deficit within our jurisdiction, those grant fundings do go more towards addressing existing deficiencies. In terms of other revenue sources, in terms of taxes, we're in California. That requires votes of people. It's very hard to get support for that. And so development impact fees are one of the very few ways that we can easily identify a revenue stream for this infrastructure. And again, only tied to the impact of the new development.
Yeah, I would just add, similar to what Heidi said, San Jose primarily being infill development, the tools are very limited. I think it's kind of lacking, to be honest. And we've sort of looked a lot at other options, and it's really challenging to find those options. We have not had good experience with CFDs and some of the other options currently in existence. I think primarily because of that infill development challenge and how you kind of assess that over existing development or new development that's infill. So I think it's really a place where I think there's sort of some opportunity for some new sort of policy thinking and ideas around that across the state about how cities could better try to finance these needs without sort of saddling housing development. I think it's sort of a big policy hurdle for cities right now.
Yeah, I want to ask a question about another point you brought up earlier, Heidi, was, market feasibility, right? You don't want your fees to be so high that you actually don't get fees because nothing gets built. And so, oftentimes to figure out what is feasible, you may need a pretty extensive or expensive feasibility analysis, and not everyone can do that, with regularity. So I'm curious for each of you, how do you kind of assess what is an appropriate fee amount that works with what the market can bear, so to speak, and kind of balances the need to bring in that revenue while still assuring that you can get a lot of housing, permits across the counter.
I can start. You're right. We cannot always do a financial feasibility analysis on every project, and in fact, we don't. It's not practical. It would actually cost more than actually administering the program. But what we do, and what every jurisdiction does, because they are required to in some form, is to report annually on housing production. So we submit that to the state of California. We in San Diego also produce an annual report on homes, and we look at a variety of different incentives and regulations that apply and see how that impacts our housing production numbers. So it is one of the things that we have the ability to look at when we look at our housing production data to see how, in fact, fees, along with many other regulations and incentives, can impact that production. So I would say that that's our best metric to be able to determine that. We have specifically monitored based off of when we've made any kind of significant changes to our fee programs or any other regulations, and looked annually at what the impacts have been on production. For us, since we've changed our fees, production has increased. So.
Jerad, Christopher, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we don't look on a project specific basis, but we look on a macro level at the economic conditions of the city. I mean, I think the challenge right now is, I think everyone's aware, especially in San Jose and the Bay Area, the economic feasibility is really challenging for multifamily. The analysis that we have, the feasibility gap that exists, on sort of hypothetical projects in the city is quite large, much larger than our entire fee stack. So, we're always sort of looking at that on an annual basis, and even though our fee stack is sort of not, doesn't add up to that feasibility gap, we did go ahead and the city council made the decision to, lower those fees just to provide some incentive to see if, it was a motivating factor. But, the economic conditions are really challenging. But I think for us, we just don't want to be the reason that's, holding up development, and trying to make those adjustments in real time, and not try to be slow to react to, which I think, historically has been sort of the downfall of cities, is to try to make adjustments in real time so that we're still getting what we need, but we're not the ones, impacting feasibility of projects.
So likewise, we don't do a review on every project, but we do every time we do an update to our fee program, whichever program it is we're doing, we'll do a comparison across the region of where does this fee compare to other jurisdictions? Where are we to Sacramento, Roseville, Folsom, other cities and counties in our immediate sort of area? Um, just inherently because we're mainly a greenfield development community, we're not as much infill as San Diego and San Jose, although we'd like to get there someday. Um, we know that those costs are going to naturally be higher because there is so much more infrastructure that needs to be put in. Some of the fees, though, we will look at and say, what are their third-party options for funding the improvements that are within whatever this category is? So when we talk about roadway improvements, do we have an opportunity to leverage into other funding streams that are available, say like a sales tax measure around transportation? Okay, that project could qualify, so we're going to apply for that grant fund or that third-party funding to help sort of buy down the cost of that particular line item. Um, there's other fees like our affordable housing fee, which goes towards helping to actually fund affordable housing development. We've got a great track record around that. Well, from a market perspective, we really need to be subsidizing much more into those projects in order to get more of those units built. And the cost of multifamily construction is just so astronomically high. But the market reality just doesn't support that. You would kill everything else in the market if you were trying to get that dollar value. So we have to look at that and do that economic analysis broadly at the fee itself, and then try to come up with what is our recommendation to our council that is reasonable. So we start to look more at what have we historically charged? What else is happening in the region? We have conversations with the building industry around where their pro formas are generally sitting and how it interacts, and try to use those all as data points to ultimately make a recommendation of the council.
I appreciate that, and I think in some of the work we've done in the past with impact fees, I think one of the things we've lifted up is the having the open line of communication with the development community and just testing out how projects are looking in this market and how will changes to the fee stack help or hurt that, right? So appreciate everyone's thoughtful approaches to that. All right, let's talk a little bit about new state laws. So as you three are all very well aware, Sacramento state capital has been very active in recent years in passing new legislation aimed at changing the ways in which cities calculate or make accessible the amount of fees are charged. And so these include requirements to make fee schedules accessible, to consider changing the ways fees are charged, so like by square footage instead of unit count, providing estimates of total fee amounts. So would love to hear from each of your perspective how implementing these new changes in state law has been going. San Jose has undertaken a lot of new approaches to try to adhere to these requirements. So Jerad, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think generally the state law changes around fees have been, kind of directionally where San Jose has been headed kind of before some of those changes. I think where some of the challenges, and this is not just related to fees, but some, in general on state law implementation is that, kind of at the state level, it can translate into harder, sort of work for us to implement versus being more, sort of tailored to individual jurisdictions. And so that can make sometimes even well-intentioned, policy changes sort of harder on us as planners and cities. But in San Jose, what we've been working on is what we're calling a development fee framework. And so, rather than sort of adopting a new unified fee, our concept is to align all of our fees around a common set of principles, to simplify the administration and calculation of those fees. Again, similar to the goals and what you mentioned in your report, to provide greater transparency and predictability for developers, especially on the front end, like you talked about. We found that really important to, that, people as they're looking to build new projects, to have some certainty into what the costs are going to be when they move forward through that entitlement process. And so our framework is aligning kind of our fee programs around common principles. So aligning all of our geography is the same, across our fee programs. Aligning the metric of calculation, which is now all standardized as square footage, but then again, making sure we have the right definition of square footage around like what specific square footage are we talking about, because that can trip things up. The timing of payment. So moving the timing of payment later in the process to try to help, on the feasibility side, trying to shift to closer to certificate of occupancy, which provides some administrative challenges, but is ultimately better, for projects. And then also thinking a little bit around the typology of development. We have different incentive programs already around high rise and sort of, based upon economics of different development typologies, and looking at how we might size the fees based on that, to match economic realities. And so that's kind of the policy work we're working on, and hope to have that to our city council by the end of the year. And then tie it again to those annual reports we have, so that we have the framework, and then we have kind of an annual process to sort of look and understand how our fees stack in the overall economics of a project. So based in San Jose.
Sure, I'll go to you next. How are you doing with all the new state laws?
Yeah, so we were actually in the middle of doing the conversion on the residential from a per unit to a square footage basis before the recent law went in. What we've done, though, is instead of saying it's on a per square foot, literal square foot basis, is we've established in the residential bands of square footage, and we've tied that back to thinking about what the dynamics of that household end up being, whether it's just generally a population or bedroom capacity that sort of falls within those square footage bands. And that allows us, and also some social economic characteristics, to be able to say, look, the larger your house is going to be, the more things like roadway impacts, the more demand for service that are going to be there. And so we're working on, as we're updating and doing the massive updates to each of our other programs, carrying that same methodology through. Now, some programs are going to be able to do that, like I think our capital facilities fee will easily be able to do that. Our active transportation fee already does. Our affordable housing fee, probably not so much. That one will probably be just a straight dollar per square foot. We also differentiate between, is it what we call traditional residential, meaning it's sort of anything coming out of the ground, versus age restricted, because those age restricted products, we tend to see fewer trip generation around that oftentimes, for various reasons. And so whether that's simply assisted care or more like a Del Webb type product, we tend to see the lower household sizes, even though the square footage of those units tend to be sort of in more the moderate range. So that, I think, has been good. We were doing fee deferrals for a while before the state law change a year or two ago. We would do those through agreements with affordable developers, and we would offer it. We did for, I think, for a while, the market rate projects. We do it on commercial through a different program. And they have different factors to them. But now with the new state law, we've converted everybody over to take advantage of that streamlining benefit, to Jared's point of doing it at occupancy. We've only seen, though, the affordable projects take advantage of it at this point. I think all of our market rate, particularly tract home development, they continue just to normally pay those fees at permit issuance. So they've not updated anything on their end, either accounting wise or something. We've reached out to ask why and really haven't heard back too much on it. There's other factors to try to standardize, and get into some of Jared's points of those sort of principles, if you will. We try to be a very standardized methodology around how the fees generally are calculated. We're trying to do better about having the same descriptions of the use categories between all of the fee programs to really standardize that. We do have a couple that are on a per acre basis as opposed to a per square foot basis, or a per unit basis, or whatever the category is. So we've been exploring that in some places, like in roadway things. And we're not talking about this type of units, but auto dealerships. Well, it's not a building so much that drives the demand for that. It's the yard space in your stock and trade area. So we look at that on a per acre basis. So we do things like that. Administrative rates, we do charge administration fees. We're trying to better standardize those across the programs so they're more consistent. But it takes a lot of tracking to be able to say, what does it do with those, and what do those fees go towards? Heidi, I guess you're up next.
Okay. So San Diego had over 40 different fees, depending on the location in the city, prior to 2020. We did start a comprehensive reform to our entire development impact fee program around 2018, and it has been in full implementation for a number of years now, after being adopted by our city council. The big significant change was that we moved to citywide fees, because accounting across over 40 different funds was resulting in the inability to spend funds. And so we had actually accumulated $500 million in separate development impact fee funds that were very, very challenging to spend down. We have, since implementation and the move to the citywide fees, spent down probably over half. I would say we're at 60% spend down of that amount. So that's been a huge positive in terms of investments in our communities and being able to accommodate new growth. We also, at that time, before 602 came into effect, fortunately for us, we were ahead of it there. We had moved to scaling, so the smaller units pay less than for larger units. Again, we do banding. We do it by the 50 square foot increment. It is very complicated for our plan reviewers to calculate out. We have tried to make this easy by having an online calculator available on our webpage. We have a spreadsheet that we require all applicants to fill out so that our planners can easily verify the amount of the fees based on the number of units, the square footage of the units, the type of use, et cetera. But we do have a fairly complex fee calculator that allows an applicant at any time to estimate their fees based off of the square footage of all of their uses. We also have certain incentives if you're located near transit or if you have a deed restricted affordable housing unit that provides for certain reductions. Those are also folded into that online calculator. We also did, before we were required to move to collecting development impact fees only at final inspection or occupancy. So we moved away from the administratively burdensome process of feeing at building permit issuance and then entering into a recorded fee deferral agreement in order to defer fees at final inspection. Most developers were wanting to do that. It was taking an inordinate amount of staff time to process them. So our code was just amended to collect at final inspection. And then one of, I would say, the most problematic requirements from the state. So all of those other state reforms have been great. We've been rolling with them. They've been generally positive. It was a huge shift. It is administratively burdensome, but overall positive outcome. The one thing that has been really challenging for us as a local agency is where the state has intervened with full exemptions from the payment of development impact fees, and we do continue to see those being introduced. Those are very challenging to us as we don't have a replacement funding source for the development.
To that, Heidi, and you talked about the calculator a little bit. I want to ask Jerad and Christopher about this because a lot of our work is centered around how helpful predictability and certainty is. So maybe even less about the total fee amount, but just knowing what is going to go into the full fee stack. So Heidi described the calculator in San Diego. And I'm curious, Jerad, Christopher, if someone is looking to build in your communities, do you offer a similar kind of a service or tool to help get a reasonable estimate for fees up front? Is again, like this is something we have heard from a lot of builders that could be really, really useful because left to their own devices, they may not know how to put those together, particularly for smaller developers, right? Who maybe don't have as much experience in a city or maybe just the time or resources to go through a full fee schedule. So we can start with Jerad or Christopher. I'll let you guys decide who wants to go first.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's something we're interested in. I think it's very challenging. I think, our kind of thought process is trying to implement, the updated framework, and then that will allow, us to come up with an easier calculator. Right now, we currently have it as more of a service, either through staff, through multiple routes to try to provide those, early estimates. And then as you get into the process, a more specific fee estimate request. But ideally, we like to get to, where San Diego is, where we have a more simplified system and calculation and calculator online, which I know we're required to do as well under upcoming state law. But I think, really trying to make some of those policy changes and programmatic changes so that the calculator is easier to have it calculate.
So we offer, again, like everybody does a form people can fill out with the basics of the project. Where are you? How many square feet of this use and that use and units and all that stuff and the unit sizes. And we can run those numbers. We do it for a lot of projects, particularly projects, affordable housing projects will ask for it at various stages. We've got a mixed use project we're getting ready to process. They've asked for it to run a couple of times. More than happy to do that. We've actually tried having a calculator on our website before. We had a vendor that we were working with, and we've ultimately decided, that solution didn't work. It was way too complicated because there's too many if-then questions around it. So I'm not sure what we're going to do to implement the state law yet, but we're going to figure it out. We have the added complexity of we are not a full service city. We don't do water. We don't do sewer. Obviously, we don't do schools. We don't do power. We don't even collect the drainage fees for the entirety of the city. There's only, I'd say, about maybe a quarter of the city that we actually collect less than a quarter of the city. We collect drainage impact fees on. The rest of it's collected by the county, just a holdover fee that we've continued to have around for that. And so you have to start sending people to each of these different agencies because while you could pull it and have some of those resource informations available, to actually be able to one calculating it, are you doing it pursuant to whatever their standards are? And some agencies, like I mean, one or two in particular, say, do not even attempt to calculate it, just send everybody to us. So that's been fun to deal with. So we just leave a line that says call, and you need to go and have that follow-up conversation. The other thing that actually has been, I think, more problematic for some of our projects has been folks will come in early in the entitlement stage and say, hey, can I get, or before even they file an entitlement, and we'll ask, hey, can I get a run of what these fees are going to look like? More than happy, we'll give it to you. And then they'll get their entitlement some number of weeks, months, maybe even a year or two later, depending on the complexity, what level of environmental we had to do, all of that. And then they go to pull their building permit 2-3 years later, and the fees have all gone up. And they're like, why didn't program for any of that? Why did the fees go up? Because all of our fees are indexed to some sort of CPI. I won't name the fee program, but we had one this last change of the calendar year that went up by double-digit percentages. In fact, the first number started with a 2. That's taken a lot of explaining, and we're using an average index, and it's based on a Caltrans number. And do we even have the right index? We'll have to relook at that and make sure we're considering that. But those sort of hits, we have to caveat everything up. This is good today. Some fees update in July, some are in January, some on some different cadence, and you just got to be prepared for that. So we have to provide some offline guidance of what have we seen historically with those updates, and people can then bake them into their pro formas how they desire. But it very much becomes a moving target. Nothing is settled until that permit is issued.
Yeah, Christopher, that you brought up a really interesting point, and one that we hear often is that, particularly in cities like Elk Grove that are not full service, the amount of city fees may not even be the majority of fees that projects face. And so it can be difficult for a builder to actually determine what those are because they have to go to, 3 or 4 or 5 other fee charging entities to figure out what the full fee stack will be. So, Christopher, you kind of described what that looks like in Elk Grove. I'm curious, in San Diego and San Jose, are there kind of best practices you have implemented to figure out, if you're not estimating all these other fees for projects that even you're not responsible for, like, how are you helping builders understand like what those fees might be?
Our fee calculator, to be clear, only includes our development impact fees. It does not include the full fee stack. We similarly have to we have multiple different school districts that operate within our jurisdictional boundaries. And so we direct on our webpage to the different resources depending on the location of it. And then with respect to water and sewer fees, we have a public utilities department that we do have to coordinate with, but those separate departments are responsible for feeing the appropriate water and sewer capacity charges. But we are working to see how we can provide the full measure within the fee calculator. It will be interesting to see how smaller cities with fewer resources are able to even do this. On the one hand, if you are a smaller city, you have less projects that you have to push through it. But it is extremely complex. And so the investment for a smaller number of permits is going to be more expensive per project to administer than it would be for a jurisdiction like ours. It is a lot of work. The fee calculator that the city of San Diego put into place just for our development impact fees is incredibly complex because of all the different requirements for incentives, exemptions in certain circumstances that are coming down from the state. There's changes, it seems like, at least twice a year that require us to go in and reprogram the calculator. So it is very administratively burdensome.
Yeah, agreed. It's very challenging. I think, we're a bit more unified, more similar to San Diego. So it's slightly more simple there, but yeah, multiple school districts, some unified, some non-unified. Um, I think what we've tried to do as one helpful exercise when we do kind of that annual look at economic feasibility, either us or our consultant goes through the process of calculating the fees on a hypothetical project. So oftentimes what we do is kind of provide that range of fees that were calculated on a hypothetical project to prospective developers so that they can kind of see what the full stack will look like. They, understand caveating that it has to be calculated exactly, but at least gives them a range of fees that's defensible to put into their pro formas early on. And it does include beyond the city fees what they could at least expect. So.
Yeah, well, thank you both for that. And with that, I'm gonna go to the audience. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A function. So if you haven't gotten your question yet, please, we're going to spend the last roughly 8 minutes going through as many as we can. I'm going to try and consolidate some of these questions. I'm seeing some themes pop up. One of them being, how do you all approach um, scaling the fee based on kind of the typology of the housing, right? Jared, you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but a fee on a large multifamily building has a different impact on feasibility than like a fourplex or a smaller project, even though they're both technically multifamily. And I think each of you answered this a little bit. I think Christopher and Heidi, you mentioned kind of bands that you have. So I'm curious if each of you could speak a little bit more about how you approach levying fees on different typologies of housing, not just multifamily and single family. And I'll let Heidi go first.
The answer is we don't. The two typologies are based off of multifamily or single family. We don't have single family development, so it's really just multifamily. But we don't distinguish between large scale multifamily, small scale infill development. The basis of the Nexus study that is very carefully put together to comply with a very complex set of regulations and constitutional requirements looks at the number of people. Essentially, it's on a per capita basis to determine what the need is from the people that live in the homes that are being developed. And so whether that is going to be in a large scale multifamily development or a small scale, the number of people is very likely to be the same based off of the unit size. And we have a whole methodology and cost unit memo that justifies that. I think it would be very hard to come up with a legally compliant methodology that took into account different development types. The conversation for that would be where there should be incentives or incentives from maybe the state, financial incentives from the state that reduce them depending on the type of product that's being delivered that is more financially infeasible to deliver to the market. But we don't have the ability, I don't think, at the local agency to provide for that.
Yeah, likewise, we do the banding. We don't differentiate single family, multifamily, duplex, halfplex, townhome. Doesn't matter. A unit's a unit's a unit. It's based upon the size of the unit. That's what 608 or whatever the bill says really speaks to. So we follow that to the letter. And I think that's worked out fairly well. And what you'll end up seeing, you take something like a roadway fee, your trip generation is based upon the trips generated on a per unit basis. That's where the IT trip generation manual comes in and helps provide that. Similarly, when you think about something like water or sewer demand, it's based upon that occupancy. So just converting in and of itself to these band basis, you're going to see some similarities there. I think the differentiation start to come in with things like landscape coverage on water. Well, but they're going to have a separate water meter that deals with that sort of stuff. And so you get other ways to manage that. Again, we're not a water purveyor, so I couldn't begin to calculate that sort of difference. But I think that's where you're going to see some differentiation happen is on maybe some particular utility lines, but things like your sewer generation is going to be the same, your trip generation is going to be the same, and a unit's a unit's a unit, which gets into the frustrating part of things like ADU requirements, where you've got to have exemption and fees for certain ADU classes. But it's a unit and you want a separate household living there. So why is it getting a break under the state law versus the regular unit size? So
Yeah, I think on the fee side, I think we're interested in, how we could differentiate typology, particularly on building type, which relates to feasibility, right? Construction types. But to Heidi's point, I think, there's a lot of limits on how that can be done within the nexuses within the law. So where we've looked at it is on the incentive side. And so, our current program is looking to incentivize, denser multifamily. So multifamily meeting a certain level of density dwelling units per acre. And then another program on top of that, looking at high-rise housing and even deeper level of incentive because the costs are much higher for that construction type as well. So it's something we're really interested in doing and really to try to both, make sure we have those developments happen and then to incentivize density in the city.
Thank you all for that. I see a couple questions here in the chat, and a question that I actually get fairly often is how the Supreme Court decision in Sheets versus El Dorado County has either changed or not changed the way that you approach fees. It's kind of wheezy in terms of what the ruling is, but I think there's a lot of interest out there about how it does or does not actually change the way we approach fees.
I'll jump in on this one. We did have our development impact fees challenged in court, interestingly, by a neighborhood organization. And we went to trial court and we did prevail. In the time during the time of the appeal, the Sheets decision came out, and the plaintiffs in the case filed an appeal to the Supreme Court citing Sheets for why our impact fee program did not meet the requirements of the Constitution as well as the Mitigation Fee Act. It's not a reported decision, but we did get a favorable opinion from the Court of Appeal that it did not affect the methodology that we had used. I largely viewed Sheets as validating the approach that we had already taken in that we were never in a position to arbitrarily identify development impact fees, and our nexus studies are very painfully established through clear methodology that relates the impact of the particular project to the impacts of the new development. I think if we hadn't at that time moved to the scaling so that, a 700 square foot unit was paying the same as a 3,000 square foot unit, I think we would have been in a different circumstance. But we do have very, very detailed nexus studies to justify our fees. And, we're pretty happy with the decision that we got out of the Court of Appeal.
I'll just say on ours, I think we, things like roadway, we go through and we itemize out. Here's everything that's in the program. These are the facilities. These are the improvements. This is the detail about how we got to the cost estimate. We do the same thing with our capital facilities fee that's going through and update our parks fees and trail fees. Like all of those details are there with a full CIP, which is a state law requirement anyway. And so to be able to say, here's that nexus component and your fair share basis goes back to, what are the underlying assumptions that you've got there instead of just, wildly, however, El Dorado County have been doing it, not to cast any shade, but something happened there. I think I feel better about where we are, and we probably all do, but it's definitely something to look at and why you definitely want to have your county council or city attorney's office reviewing that stuff and working with a qualified consultant that can help you navigate through necessary findings and the documentation to support that.
Great. Thank you all for that. And it squares with kind of how I saw this is that, a lot of the cities we have looked at, I mean, they really have to meticulously document why they are charging these fees. And, the in the Sheets case, it seems like it almost like validates some of the work that you are already doing. Well, we're right at time. So I want to take a moment to thank all three of you for sharing your expertise and your experience with us. I learned a lot. I have a bunch of notes here, and I hope our audience got a lot out of this as well. So thank you again for being with us. Before we say goodbye, I do want to take a quick moment to make sure know about our friends at Terner Labs. They are now accepting applications for the Housing Venture Lab, which is an accelerator program that includes $75,000 in seed funding, in-depth coaching, and connections to a network of partners. So application is February 20th. We have a lot of awesome organizations and groups and companies that have come through this program. So if you think you might be the next one, please feel free to put in an application again. They close on the 20th of this month. With that, again, I want to thank you all for being here. Thanks to everyone who joined us, and we will have a recording to share in the coming weeks. So thank you all again, and see you next time.